This is for September 24th. This is the end of Lesson 6. We learned yesterday that Henry Clinton, the British commander, had devised a plan in which he would take his army south, he would capture Charleston, and he would capture Savannah. Now, after he had done that, he would go back to New York, and Lord Cornwallis would take over most of the soldiers from his command. Cornwallis would move to the north. Henry Clinton, when he got back to New York City, would move from the south, and somewhere in the colony of Virginia, Washington would be surrounded by the British, and the war would be over. We know that things didn't work out for the Americans, that the Continental Army had been given over to Horatio Gates, that Horatio Gates had taken on Cornwallis in Camden in South Carolina and had faced a disastrous battle. Many of the Americans were killed or missing. With Gates out of command, the only man who was in the area that could take command of what was the Continental Army would be Nathaniel Greene. Now, Nathaniel Greene had been part of the Continental Army ever since the Battle of Bunker Hill. Greene is going to take a change of tactics. Instead of taking on the British, for the next year, Greene is going to do a series of hit and run tactics in hopes that he can draw Cornwallis away from his supply line in South Carolina, and then Cornwallis would be forced to head to the sea. While all of this is going on, George Rogers Clark is going to leave the Virginia frontier and go into the Ohio River Valley. Now, the British had built some forts in the Ohio River Valley. Clark is going to attack these forts during the winter. One is at Kaskaskia in what is now Illinois. The other is in Vincennes in what is now Indiana. Clark and his men will be successful in driving the British out, and this will become important when the British decide to surrender, because all of this land will be given over to the Americans. It was during Greene's campaign that the Americans will take on the British in two different locations. In Cowpen, South Carolina, which is not too far from Camden, under Daniel Morgan, the Americans will attack the Redcoat Loyalists who had been joining the army. It is a great victory for the Americans. Now, the British were led by a brash cavalry officer by the name of Tarleton, and Tarleton and his militia for the British are going to be attacked and forced to give up the hill. About 2 months later, Cornwallis will fall into a trap at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. Now, Greene had put North Carolina and Virginia militia out front and had ordered them, after they fired 2 shots, to start to retreat in a hasty manner. Greene had hoped that Cornwallis would send in his troops to follow them, and when Cornwallis did, the troops realized that there were Continental soldiers on either side of them, and they were literally sucked into a trap. Guilford Courthouse was a great victory for the Americans. Again, it is Nathaniel Greene for the Continentals and Cornwallis for the Redcoats. Now, after defeats at Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis believes that he must turn to the sea. Cornwallis is going to turn his army toward the sea, and the only place where Cornwallis can go, where ocean-going ships can enter, is Yorktown, Virginia. Now, Yorktown, Virginia is very close to what we call Jamestown in Lesson 3. It is here that Cornwallis is going to send a small number of ships to New York City and to ask Clinton for relief. At this time, unbeknownst to the British, the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse will take up stations off of the coast of Virginia. De Grasse will not let any British ships in or any other ships out. The British are now bottled up in Yorktown. But are there enough men in Greene or Morgan's command to attack the British? And the answer is no. The only group would be George Washington and what was left of his Continental Army that had not gone with Gates. Washington will slip away from New York before Clinton realizes what has happened. Washington will arrive in Yorktown. He will take up residence around Yorktown. Greene and Morgan will also join in, and General Rochambeau of the French army will arrive with de Grasse's ships, and they will take up a portion. Yorktown now is completely surrounded, and Washington will begin a siege. Now, a siege is where you starve your enemy out. Each day, Washington's artillery would fire shells into Yorktown. Each night, the Americans would creep closer and closer to the British lines. In October of 1781, the British are forced to surrender their entire army. Now, this is a much bigger army than what Burgoyne had surrendered in Saratoga. Yorktown becomes the last major battle of the American Revolution. To quote the French, the world has turned upside down. Both sides agreed that there would be a need of a peace treaty. And in 1782, and that should be 1782, a peace treaty was hammered out in Paris. The British were so reluctant to stay for the painting that they left before the painter could paint in the British people who were at the treaty. Well, what exactly did the treaty say? Well, the treaty gave independence to the 13 states. That was a given. The treaty also said, though, that all of the lands along the Ohio River are those of the 13 states. Now, the language was a little ambiguous. Does it mean just along the Ohio River? That's how the British saw it. Or does it mean as far north as the Great Lakes and as far south as the Gulf of Mexico? That's how the Americans saw it. And that's why several years later we will have to fight the War of 1812. Then the Americans agreed that they would pay off all the debts to those loyalists who had been forced to leave. Now, unfortunately for the loyalists, the Americans never did pay off the debts. The Articles of Confederation Congress refused to appropriate money, and when the United States Congress was created under Washington in 82, again they refused. This is another reason why the British will attack us in the War of 1812. Well, again, it's important that we know the sites of these battles. Now, Guilford Courthouse is here in North Carolina. Vincennes is over here on the Ohio River. Over here on the Ohio, Guilford Courthouse is right here. Yorktown is here in Virginia. Make sure you know what are the names of all of the people involved. On tomorrow, we will do a walkout worksheet, and then there will be a video for you to watch with some questions. Tuesday, we will look over our notes, go over questions, and then if you think you're ready, you can simply study for the test or study for other classes. And then Wednesday, we will take our unit exam on Unit 3.